Hello, we're back and we're going to continue on now with our second lecture from Chapter 9. We're going to talk about skeletal muscle structure. So what are some of the major parts of a skeletal muscle? That's what we'll do in this particular video lecture, and then in the next ones we're going to start zooming in to the cell level, going inside an individual muscle fiber or muscle cell and seeing some of the important parts there that we're going to be discussing during this chapter. I wanted to put this picture up here at the beginning of the lecture just to reiterate for you that your skeletal muscles do not operate without input from the nervous system. And this is kind of a neat colorized image. This is an image that was taken with a type of microscope called an electron microscope. So it's able to generate these very detailed, beautiful three-dimensional images. And then they're colorized to help you see things more clearly. But the red cylinders you see here are individual muscle fibers, which we'll be learning about during this unit. And then colorized in yellow here, those are branches from a nerve cell called a motor neuron. And motor neurons are the nerve cells that control skeletal muscles. So that's actually going to be part of a motor neuron, motor referring to movements. And every muscle, all right, so a whole skeletal muscle like your biceps brachii muscle, the individual muscles you're going to be learning about over on the anatomy side, is served by one fairly large artery. Now that artery is going to branch out into smaller ones that will infiltrate that whole muscle, because you got to make sure the whole muscle, even deep down inside it, you've got a good blood supply. One nerve, and then one or more veins that are going to wind up draining blood off of the skeletal muscle to help take away the wastes that your skeletal muscle fibers generate. That's something you should have in mind now as well. Arteries bring blood that contains nutrients and oxygen gas to your tissues. Veins take away the deoxygenated blood and blood that contains the wastes like the carbon dioxide that your cells give off as part of their normal functions. All right, so let's look inside a generic skeletal muscle here. Well, this is not really a generic skeletal muscle. This would be one of the muscles attached to your femur. Hopefully you're recognizing the distal end of the femur, the distal epiphysis of the femur there. And so this would be one of the muscles sitting over your thigh, one of your quadricep muscles that is attached to the femur. All right, so what we're looking at here, we're progressively zooming in on different parts of the muscle here. So this is a whole muscle that's been cut open for us in a cross section. And notice there is a covering right on here, kind of looks like a film on the outside of the skeletal muscle. That is a connective tissue covering called the epimysium. Remember, epi means to sit over something. So the epimysium is actually a connective tissue covering, a dense, irregular connective tissue covering around the outside of a whole muscle. And that's continuous with, or it blends in with, the periosteum. Remember, your dense, irregular connective tissue covering you have around the outsides of your bones. Those types of things blend together to hold connective tissues connect. So that's one of the things that helps hold skeletal muscles to your bones. Notice also you got a tendon. Let me erase that for a second. Notice over here you got a tendon. Tendons are dense, regular connective tissue structures. So that epimysium more or less just kind of blends together and forms a dense, regular connective tissue structure that attaches to the bone. So tendons connect muscles, skeletal muscles, to bones. Hopefully you remember from Unit 3 that ligaments attach bones to other bones. They're built from the same type of tissue. All right, and then if we, now progressing inward, all right, so do you see how the skeletal muscle, if we look inside it, it's been cut open, and you can see it kind of has these little individual compartments in there. Each of those little compartments in there is called a fascicle of the whole skeletal muscle. And over here, what they're doing in the diagram is pulling one of those fascicles out. So everything you see there is a fascicle. This whole thing, we've zoomed in, all of this, everything inside there is a fascicle. The fascicle actually has a connective tissue covering around it, and that is called the perimysium. That's fairly thick. The next time, if you look over here, this probably looks like a piece of steak for you. And the next time you look at a piece of steak or a piece of pork, look at it, you can look inside there and see some of these things that we're talking about, because when you're looking at a steak, that is a skeletal muscle from a cow that has been cut open and cross-section, kind of like what we're seeing here. Okay, and then let me erase that. All right, so that fascicle, what is a fascicle? A fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. That's what a fascicle is. So like right there, oops, no, my pen's still on. There we go, like right there, right there, right there, right there. You're seeing an individual muscle fiber that's been cut open and cross-sectioned so that you can see the inside of it. And then over here, one of those muscle fibers has been pulled out. So a muscle fiber is one cell, one skeletal muscle cell. So this almost kind of reminds me of, one of those Russian dolls where you got the bigger doll and you open it up and you got the smaller one inside, and then you open that one up and you've got the even smaller one inside. Some of these structures within the skeletal muscle are kind of like that. You're moving down to smaller and smaller levels. And unfortunately, they look kind of similar and they have kind of similar names. So you want to work with this and make sure you understand the differences between these different parts and at what level of organization for a skeletal muscle they exist. One more connective tissue name here. Every muscle fiber actually has, outlining in yellow there, they're in cross-section or in covering that muscle fiber that's been pulled out. There's a connective tissue covering around each individual muscle fiber, and that's called endomysium. Endomysium meaning inside. So your connective tissue coverings, you've got an epimysium that covers the whole muscle. Then each fascicle inside the muscle is covered by a perimysium. And then finally, each individual muscle fiber, each individual cell has a very thin, delicate connective tissue covering around it, and that's called the endomysium. These connective tissue, why do you have to have that? It helps insulate the muscle fibers. It's almost functioning like insulation around wires. Because as we'll see, just because you're contracting one muscle fiber within a whole muscle that you see here does not necessarily mean you want every muscle fiber in that muscle contracting. So that covering helps provide some insulation against that happening. These connective tissue coverings also provide passageways for blood vessels, as we talked about back when we covered the tissues in Unit 2. Connective tissues provide passageways for blood vessels and nerves and lymphatic vessels, spaces for those to pass through. All right, and before we move on, if you notice here, so we pulled out, we said this is one muscle fiber. Now if you look inside there, it looks like you've got a bunch of cylinders in there as well, and that is true. An individual muscle fiber has a bunch of long cylinders inside it as well, and we'll be talking about what those are also. All right, here's another look. This is a table from your textbook, which is pretty good. You might want to take a look at this just to review the terminology, start working with the new terminology. The sooner you learn that, the easier this unit will be. And as I mentioned, so if you're down here at the level of an individual muscle cell, within that cell there are actually cylinder-like units, and those are called myofibrils. And those are not cells, those are protein bundles. This is one cell. So the little fibers you're seeing in there that are called the myofibrils, those are actually protein bundles, and those are actually where your contraction takes place. So you can see a muscle fiber is actually full of protein fibers called myofibrils, which is why meat has a lot of protein in it. We know that from, everybody knows that. If you need a good source of protein, you eat meat. That's because skeletal muscle tissue, when you get down to the cell level, is filled with all these little myofibrils that are bundles of proteins that are important for contraction. And we'll be seeing a whole lot more about that as we move through this particular unit. Okay, so now this slide has written out what I already talked about on the diagram, so that's just there for you if you want to review. Let's talk about those skeletal muscle attachments. Again, what do skeletal muscles attach to? As I mentioned earlier, muscles may attach directly to bones or cartilage. Okay, so the epimysium of a muscle may be directly fused into the periosteum, that connective tissue around a bone, or the perichondrium around hyaline cartilage. So if you remember, the periosteum around the bone is analogous to the connective tissue covering you have around cartilage, and that's called a perichondrium. Or then indirectly, this is where the epimysium of a skeletal muscle, kind of like we were taking a look at on the other diagram, narrows and bundles together and forms a dense regular connective tissue structure called a tendon. That's a rope-like structure. And then in other cases, and we'll talk a little bit about this over on the anatomy side, you can have dense regular connective tissue structures that are called aponeuroses. With an E would be plural, with an I is singular. These are sheets of dense connective tissues that connect muscles to each other, connect muscles to underlying tissues of the body. Like when you look at your abdominal muscles, for example, over here, you've probably seen this before. They often have gray tissue drawn in around where the abdominal muscles are located. And those are called, that's an example of an aponeurosis. So in those gray areas, you don't have skeletal muscle tissue, you actually have dense regular connective tissues that are linking those abdominal muscles together. All right, so now that was the anatomy of a whole muscle, like a whole quadriceps muscle or a whole biceps brachii muscle. And we got down to that muscle fiber individual cell level. In the next lecture, we're going to go inside the cells and explore the different parts in there, because there's quite a bit of new terminology that's used specifically for your skeletal muscle fibers. That we need to learn before we can start getting deeper into the function of those of your skeletal muscles. So we'll talk about that in the next lecture.